right, thank you, Michael. Let me get set up here. Okay, I'm going to get set up here. All right, well, good evening to you all. We're going to have some fun. Amen? So the good bishop established a general framework of why we're here at this conference, of articulating the relationship between faith and reason. And the good bishop zeroed in a very beautiful way of articulating the relationship between faith and empirical science. And Dr. Trasankos went further in that relationship between faith and empirical science. This presentation tonight, we're going to continue to reflect upon the relationship between faith and reason. But what we're going to emphasize is the relationship between faith and historical sciences, or historical knowledge. In answering the question, is the Jesus story a myth? And obviously, you probably have already guessed how I'm going to answer that question. No. But as an apologist, and what we do at Catholic Answers, we not only give the what answers, we also give the why answers. So what I want to do tonight, in the brief time that we have together, is to share with you reasons why the Jesus story is not a myth. And that we have good historical evidence, we have historical knowledge that the Jesus story is real. And this is extremely important for us as Christians who are commanded by our first Pope, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, where he says, always be ready to give an answer to anyone or a defense to anyone that asks you a reason for the hope that is within you. Within our secular cultures, both here in Australia and in America, we have many people who are doubting the Christian story. And this mythical objection, the mythicist objection, takes on a variety of different forms. So it's important for us as evangelizers who are going out to make disciples of all nations, to persuade skeptics within our secular cultures, that we are aware of the various forms that the mythicist objection takes, so that we can pull the right arrow out from the quiver, so that we can properly direct it to the correct target. So one version that the mythicist objection takes is Jesus never existed, period. Perhaps you've encountered that in your conversation with your son or your daughter, or your grandson or your granddaughter. Perhaps your son or daughter went off to college, comes home for Christmas break or something, or Thanksgiving break, or whatever that break may be, and says, all that stuff we learned in church, mom or dad, is nothing but a big hoax. Because Jesus of Nazareth never existed and was not a historical person. The second version of the mythicist objection states, well, maybe perhaps Jesus existed, maybe he was a real historical guy, but we can't really trust what these gospel writers are telling us about Jesus because they're just ripping off of all of those pagan mythologies within ancient cultures. And the third version of the mythicist objection states that, well, maybe perhaps Jesus existed, but we really can't trust the New Testament documents because they're simply legendary developments. Because they were written so many years after the events that they record, they pretty much just embellished all of the details about the Jesus story, and that shrouds the Jesus of history. It puts up a barrier for us to actually come to know the Jesus of history. So, is the Jesus story nothing but a hoax? Can we trust these New Testament Christian these Christian documents that record for us about the life of Jesus of Nazareth? Now, for us as Christians, the historicity of the New Testament documents and the Jesus story is not absolutely essential and necessary for our faith, for as the early church fathers articulated, in particular St. Irenaeus of Lyon, that we have sacred tradition. We have a Christian heritage that transmitted the Jesus event and Jesus' teaching. And even Irenaeus was clear that even if we didn't have the writings of the early Christians, we could appeal to the tradition. Amen? Amen. But in our secular cultures, when we're evangelizing skeptics and unbelievers, that ain't going to fly. And so this is why we have to be equipped and ready to be able to defend the trustworthiness of our Christian sources, of our New Testament, both the Gospels and the epistles. So, does that sound interesting? Amen. Y'all ready? Say amen. Amen. Okay, don't be shy. All right. So let's get with it and let's have some fun in inquiring into the historical knowledge of our faith. We're going to tackle first version 1 of the Mythicist Objection, the claim that Jesus did not exist. He was not a historical person. Now, one of the main reasons why skeptics will assert that Jesus never existed and that we can't trust these early Christian documents is because they're Christian. They would have been biased to the stuff. They had an agenda in their writing. And so because they're Christian, we can't trust what they tell us about Jesus. So how do we respond to this common claim? Well, folks, if we can't trust the Christian documents about Jesus because they are Christian, well, then we can't trust historical accounts of the Holocaust written by Jews. We could not trust what the Roman historian Tacitus tells us about the Roman emperors, such as Nero. We wouldn't be able to trust what American historians tell us about George Washington and the Revolutionary War. If we can't trust these Christian sources because they are Christian and they have an investment in what they're trying to convey, well, then we couldn't trust Plato and what he tells us about his mentor, Socrates. Do you see it? You see how unreasonable this skeptic approach is? Rather than not trusting the Christian sources because they are Christian, I would suggest to you, we ought to trust the Christian sources because they are Christian. Why? Because they have an investment in what they're trying to convey, they're going to ensure fidelity in transmitting the historical record. So that's one way in which we can respond to this argument from skeptics that say, well, those Christians were just biased. It is reasonable for us as Christians to appeal to our own historical sources about our Master Jesus Christ. But let's just say, for argument's sake, in conversation with the skeptic, even though we're within our rights to appeal to our own Christian sources, and that's perfectly just and reasonable, there are actually non-Christian sources that do affirm the historical reality of Jesus Christ. So for our skeptic friend, just to ease his mind, right? And to satisfy his inquiry, we have non-Christian sources that affirm the historical reality of Jesus of Nazareth. First witness to the witness stand. First century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, here is what he writes. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man. And historians tell us that's a clue that this part of the passage is authentic, because the early Christians within the Christian community normally didn't refer to Jesus as a wise man. So that phrase in reference to Jesus is dissimilar to what the early Christian community used. So that's an indication that this part of the passage is not some sort of Christian interpolation. This is coming from Josephus himself. So about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds. Josephus acknowledged this Jesus of Nazareth did some pretty cool stuff. And then he goes on to say, he, Jesus, won over many. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not forsake him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. So he's affirming in the late first century that the Christian community had not disappeared but was present. And affirms what the gospel writers tell us, that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is classic. This is gold for us as Christians, seeing that we have non-Christian sources affirming these gospel details about Jesus. How about the second century Roman historian, first and second century Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, and his work, The Annals, 1544, he writes this: consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, and that refers to crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Tacitus affirms that the Christian movement made itself to Rome, affirming details that the gospel writers tell us, that this Jesus of Nazareth was a historical person put to death by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Folks, that's a slam dunk concerning non-Christian sources affirming what our Christian sources tell us about Jesus. There are a few other non-Christian sources, but I'm going to skip over those due to time. So these are ways or strategies that we can employ in order to respond to that first version of the mythicist objection, namely that Jesus was not a historical person. We have good historical evidence, both from Christian sources, which we're within our rights to appeal to, and non-Christian sources, that Jesus was at least a real historical guy. Okay? So that deals with version 1. Now let's move to version 2 of the mythicist objection, which states that perhaps, once again, perhaps Jesus may have existed. He may have been a real historical person. But we can't really trust what these early Christian sources are telling us about Jesus, because they're nothing but a ripoff of all those pagan mythologies. The Roman mythologies of Mithras, or the Egyptian mythologies of Horus and Osiris. How do we respond to this version of the mythicist objection? And our response is very important, because this is gaining ground within our secular cultures, not in the academic world, but on the ground, in the popular world, on the internet, which is the source of education for all young adults. or should I say non-education, right? Because it's not appropriate education that they're receiving. So here are some ways in which you, in evangelizing the secular culture, can respond to the copycat version of the mythicist objection. Number 1, This mythicist approach or this mythicist objection entirely disregards the historicity of the Gospels. What I'm going to share with you, I'm going to whet your appetite in a few moments, with ways in which we can defend the historical reliability of the four Gospels. And so if this mythicist objection is even going to get off the ground, you have to first prove that the Gospels are not historically reliable, which is a futile task. So this mythicist objection, all those early Christians were just ripping off of those pagan mythologies, they're totally disregarding the mountain of evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels. That's its first flaw. Secondly, those early Christians who are telling us about who are giving us the Jesus story, what kind of people were they? They were Jews who believed in one God, creator of heaven and earth, and they followed all of the Jewish precepts. They were a monotheistic religion. And guess what? They were surrounded by a pagan culture. And guess what further? They didn't like it. It is highly unlikely that these first century monotheistic Jews would be looking to pagan mythologies to rip off of them in order to convey this story or present this story about Jesus. That is extremely unlikely, folks. You're not going to have first century Jews ripping off of pagan mythologies. Third response, correlation doesn't equal causation. You see, many skeptics will try to make parallels between these pagan mythologies, right? Such as the Roman mythology of Mithras and the Egyptian mythology of Osiris, say, and they try to draw parallels. Well, Mithras was born of a virgin, so too Jesus. Osiris rose from the dead. He was a dying and rising God. Well, that's what you find in the Jesus story. A self-proclaimed divine being who dies and rises. Now, let's just say for argument's sake that we can see that there are such parallels. Correlation, just because it happens that there are similarities between the two, it doesn't entail causation. And here's a great example. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Now, of course, I'm dealing with American history here, okay, guys? So please just bear with me here. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. The names Lincoln and Kennedy each have 7 letters. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Both married in their 30s a 24-year-old socially prominent girl who could speak fluent French. Both presidents dealt with civil rights movements for African Americans. Both presidents were shot in the back of the head on a Friday before a major holiday while sitting next to their wives. Both their assassins were known by 3 names consisting of 15 letters: John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and was captured in a theater. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and was captured in a warehouse. Both assassins were shot and killed with a Colt revolver days after they assassinated the president and before they could be brought to trial. Both presidents were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson from the South, born in 1808 and 1908, respectively. Are we to say that one caused the other? Are we to say that because of the correlation and the similarities, one was a ripoff of the other? No. So even if we grant our secularist friend that there are such similarities and parallels between the Jesus story and the mythological stories, that wouldn't prove anything. You see? But we can go further and challenge the parallels. Folks, the alleged parallels between the Jesus story and the pagan mythologies are bogus. Consider what I said earlier. Many skeptics will assert and claim that Mithras within Roman mythology was born of a virgin in order to show that Jesus' virgin birth was a ripoff of Mithras. Well, guess what, folks? Mithras emerged from a rock. He was a rock-born god. Does that sound like anything like a virgin birth? Not quite. Now, your secularist friend might be very sharp and may have been reading Mithras' books and websites, and so he may object and counter in the following manner. You ready? Well, hold on, Karlo. That's the Roman version of Mithras. The Persian legends have Anaita, the mother of Mithra, conceiving Mithra within her womb as a virgin. Because there is an inscription at a dedicatory temple in Iran dating from 200 BC, which reads this: Anaita, the Immaculate Virgin Mother Goddess of the Lord Mithra. So how do you explain that, Mr. Catholic apologist? Right? Well, check this out, folks. In the Persian legends, Anaita conceived Mithra by coming into contact with Zoroaster's 400-year-old sperm while she swam in a lake. Sure, there was no cooperation of a human father, in a direct way at least, but that is nothing compared to what the Christians tell us about the virgin birth of Jesus, or at least the conception of Jesus. There was no material stuff involved whatsoever. Okay, well, what about the dying and rising God parallels? For many will claim that Osiris was a dying and rising God, just like in the Jesus story. Well, guess what? According to Egyptologist Henry Frankfurt, Osiris never returned to this life. He reigned as king of the underworld, as an Egyptian prayer reads in the Book of the Dead. Grant thou, Osiris, to me a place in the netherworld, near the lords of right and truth. My estate may it be permanent, and Sekhet etep. So it's a prayer to Osiris as king of the underworld. Osiris never rose from the dead, folks. Did the early Christians claim that Jesus rose from the dead? Yes. They did not claim. They claimed that he went down into the underworld. Amen. On Holy Saturday. 1 Peter chapter, help me out, Tim Staples, chapter 4, verse 19? 3:19. I'm not Catholic enough. St. Peter tells us that Jesus went to the spirits in prison, phulake there in Greek, the abode of the dead, to preach to them the good news. So he did go into the abode of the dead, like Osiris. But Jesus rose from the grave on first day of the week, on Sunday. That's the Christian story, not Osiris reigning in the underworld. So folks, these are ways, strategies in which we can respond to version 2 of the mythicist objection and show that it is indeed bunk. There's nothing. As Tim Staples always said in his best theological language, what is it, Tim? Hogwash. If you haven't noticed, I'm a Tim Staples fan. He's my boss. I have to earn brownie points with him, right? How am I doing, boss? Good. All right. Now, in the remaining time that we have together, and by the way, Michael, I don't know what time I have to go to and when I have to stop, so you're going to have to give me some signals here. Now we come to version 3 of the mythicist objection. Version 3 of the mythicist objection, as I stated earlier, might acknowledge once again that perhaps Jesus was a historical person, but that we can't trust what the New Testament Gospels tell us about Jesus because they're nothing but legendary developments. They're not trustworthy. They're written many years after the events that they record, which allows for legendary developments. And that shrouds the Jesus of history, not allowing us to have access to what Jesus said and did in order for us to build our Christian faith on. And so for a secular person who thinks like this, well, why should I believe in Jesus? I can't even trust these historical documents or these sources that tell us about Jesus. So how do we defend the historical reliability of the Gospels within our secular age? So let's get with it. Strategy 1. Let me back up one step. There is an acronym for you to remember, to help you remember these strategies. AID. A-I-D, for those of you who are taking notes. Strategy 1, the Gospel writers were able to write reliable history. 2, the Gospel writers intended to write reliable history. And 3, the Gospel writers did write reliable history. AID, able, intended, and did. So let's go through those 3. First strategy, we need to show that the Gospel writers were able to write reliable history. And then we can give 3 reasons for this. Number 1, 2 of the 4 Gospels were eyewitnesses of the events that they're recording. And particularly and especially within the ancient culture, for ancient documents, when you have an eyewitness account of an event within ancient history, that's gold, man. That's phenomenal to have an eyewitness account of some historical event, especially when we're talking about this time period. The other 2, so that would be Matthew and John, the other 2 Gospels, Mark and Luke, were close associates of eyewitnesses. And according to standards for ancient historical records, that's gold as well. So that's the first reason why we have good reason to think the Gospel writers would have been able to write reliable history. They were eyewitnesses. They experienced this stuff. 2 of the authors were close associates. They were constantly in contact with eyewitnesses who were telling their story about Jesus. You ever encounter those Protestants who talk all about Jesus all the time? Well, guess what? It ain't a Protestant thing. It's a Catholic thing. Because the first Christians were Catholic, and guess what they talked about? They talked about Jesus. And they told the Jesus story. And those first century Christians who were close associates with them had access to that story from eyewitnesses. This is one reason why they would have been able to write reliable history. Second reason why the Gospel writers would have been able to write reliable history is that they are writing with close temporal proximity to the events that they are recording. You would think that the shorter the time frame is between the events and the records of the events, the better, right? Makes sense. The shorter the time frame is, the shorter the gap, the smaller the gap, the more reliable the records will be. So, how close are the Gospels to the events that they record? Well, first, we know, for example, that Matthew and Mark were not written any later than AD 68, because Irenaeus of Lyon in AD 181, in his work against heresies, tells us that Matthew wrote his gospel while Peter and Paul were still alive during the reign of Nero. Now we know Peter died roughly about AD 65. Paul subsequently died about AD 67 or so. So that means Matthew wrote his gospel before AD 65 for sure. And the reason why I say no later than AD 68 is because Nero's reign ended in AD 68 when he died. So we know Matthew wrote his gospel right around AD 65, right before. And scholars tell us that Mark wrote his gospel before Matthew. So that puts Mark and Matthew's gospel dating to about AD 65 according to Irenaeus of Lyon. But we can go even back further than that. Because according to Acts chapter 28, in Acts chapter 28 verses 16 through 31, Luke tells us and gives us the narrative of Paul's house arrest and how he makes an appeal to Caesar. But what's interesting is that Luke's narrative cuts off immediately. Luke never tells us about the martyrdom. He doesn't tell us how Caesar responded, nor does Luke tell us about the martyrdom of St. Paul. And you would think Luke would do this, given the fact that he recorded the martyrdom of Stephen and the martyrdom of James the Greater. But he doesn't tell us the martyrdom of the great St. Paul, of whom Luke was a companion and best friends with. So scholars give a plausible explanation of this and say that Luke was writing the Acts of the Apostles during the house arrest of St. Paul and finished it before Caesar answered Paul's appeal. Now, scholars tell us that Paul was under house arrest about AD 62. Some even say AD 60, but let's just go with AD 62. Now, that's the Acts of the Apostles. We know that Luke wrote his gospel before the Acts of the Apostles, right? Because the Acts of the Apostles are the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. And we know that Matthew and Mark wrote before the Gospel of Luke. So guess what? We have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, being written within or right at 30 years removed from the events that they're recording. Now, you might be thinking, well, golly, Karlo, 30 years, that's quite a long time. But compare this to the biographies of Alexander the Great. We've all heard of Alexander the Great, right? Yes? Okay, fantastic. Now watch this. The oldest existing biographies of Alexander are by Diodorus in the 1st century BC, Quintus Curtius in the 1st century AD, and Plutarch and Arrian, the two best works, who wrote in the early 2nd century AD. So the biographies of Alexander the Great are 300 and even over 400 years removed from the events that they are recording. Now, these sources refer to eyewitness accounts and written sources, but we don't have those sources. They don't exist. So, folks, I ask you, what do you think is more reliable according to the historical standards for ancient literature? Documents that are within and right at 30 years removed from the events that they record, or documents that are well over 300 and even over 400 years removed from the events that they record? What do you think? The first one, right? The 30 years. And folks, history, world civilization textbooks typically rely on these summaries about Alexander the Great. Who's being biased here? Right? Now, your skeptic friend's going to say, well, wait a minute, Karlo. Okay, so I see that these New Testament documents are close, temporally speaking, to the events that they record. And even compared to other biographies of ancient figures, these Christian sources, they're towering above them. But Karlo, you tell me. In fact, brother, what's your name? Shay? Shay? Shay, all right. Shay, did I get that right? Did I say it right? Ooh, close. I've been in Australia a few days now. I'm picking up on this stuff. Oh, you're English. All right. Great, man, great. Well, they all sound the same to me, man. Okay, Shay, you tell me, do you remember what you ate for lunch 2 weeks ago? Nah, he said. Do you remember what you ate for lunch 1 week ago? Nah. Well, Shay, if you can't remember what you ate for lunch 1 week ago, how in the world do you expect those early Christians to remember what Jesus said and did 30 years after the events that they're recording? Can you feel the weight of that objection? So it would seem that these early Christians were unable to write reliable history. So how do we respond to this? Well, folks, the apostles would have been able to write reliable history because they would have been able to memorize the teachings of Jesus. Number one, they didn't receive a lecture in a fly-by lecture hall like you are tonight, where you're going to go home and you're going to say, what in the world did Karlo talk about? I can't remember a darn thing he said. But then you're going to pull out my book, Prepare the Way, Overcoming Obstacles, God, the Gospel, and the Church, and I guarantee you that you're going to remember. because everything I'm talking about tonight, guess what? It's in the book. So I encourage you out there to get the book. They didn't receive a lecture in a fly-by lecture hall. They were students of Jesus, folks. They lived with Jesus day in and day out. And Jesus would not have been giving his teachings just one time. He would have been giving his teachings over and over and over again in the 3 years that they lived with him. Not just in public, but in private as well, as even the gospel narratives tell us that Jesus took them aside and explained to them the meanings of the parables. Listen, Tim and I, we stay up late into the wee hours of the night when we travel together, talking and geeking out in philosophy and theology. Just this morning, we were annoying everybody else in the house because we were talking theology and they were trying to eat their breakfast. The apostles would have been doing that with Jesus all the time. Jesus, what do you mean by this? That was some weird stuff, Jesus. Help us understand this. And they would have learned it. And so they were in circumstances where they would have been able to memorize these teachings of Jesus. Secondly, the apostles frequently rehearsed Jesus' teaching. According to Matthew 10, verses 1 through 23, we're told that they went out to preach and rehearsing frequently these teachings of Jesus. They lived in a cultural milieu where memory skills were highly valued, right? Because they were oral culture. We're a written culture. Everything's written, and even now everything's in the electronic devices. But in ancient times, they lived in oral cultures where information was primarily transmitted orally, and that was the prized way of transmitting information. The gospel writers also have oral sources, scholars tell us, that predate the actual records. Luke tells us this in his prologue in Luke chapter 1. He's pulling from sources and from traditions that have been handed down. Scholars even tell us that it's very likely there would have been written notes, especially in light of Matthew being a tax collector who would have been literate and able to take notes, because scholars talk about how there's evidence that in the 1st century, 2nd century of Judaism, the students of the rabbis would take hand notes. And so it's possible that Matthew and some of the other apostles would have been noting down what Jesus said and what he did. And finally, there was leadership in the early church to ensure faithful transmission of the teachings of Jesus. So folks, this idea that the early Christians would have been unable to memorize or to remember what Jesus said and did is not true. We have every good reason to think that they would have been able to memorize Jesus' teachings and what he did, and consequently able to record reliable history. So that's A. The gospel writers were able to write reliable history. Now wait a minute, Shay. Perhaps they would have been able to write reliable history, but did they intend to write reliable history? Because it's possible that they had an intention to write some sort of legend about Jesus, some sort of myth about Jesus, and create this sort of legend. So what reason do we have to think that they intended to write reliable history as opposed to legend or myth? Well, a few reasons for this real quick. Number one, the gospel writers record details that are subject to historical verification. They are not the content of legendary genre. So, for example, they're recording historical events, the Passover, the Festival of Tabernacles, historical individuals, Pontius Pilate, Joseph Caiaphas, John the Baptist, Caesar Augustus, Herod, Felix, Archelaus, Agrippa, Gallio, Caiaphas, Ananias. Myths don't talk about historical people like that who are subject to historical verification, especially individuals who hold high prominent offices within history. They talk about historical time periods. For example, in Luke 3:1, Luke tells us in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea and Herod being tetrarch. They're talking about historical time periods here. These are not the details of legendary genre. Reason number two why we know they intended to write reliable history. The gospel writers actually express their intention. They're literally saying, hey guys, hello, McFly. Okay, that's an American thing. You ever saw Back to the Future? All right, that might not have worked. I apologize. I messed up here. Different country. Okay. The gospel writers express. Luke says in his prologue that he is intending to write reliable history. He uses the Greek word help me out, Tim. Diegesis. There we go, something like that. It's a Greek word and I actually practiced that word before the talk and it just didn't come out. It's a Greek word that the Greco-Roman authors used for writing of history. Luke talks about eyewitnesses. Luke identifies the purpose of his gospel to give the truth, or as the Greek word can be literally translated, the facts. Luke expressly expresses his intention to write reliable history. And reason number 3, we know they intended to write reliable history. This is fascinating because the Gospels actually parallel ancient historical biographies, like the life of Josephus, the parallel lives written by the Greek historian Plutarch, the lives of the Caesars written by the Roman historian Suetonius, the life of Demonax written by Lucian. And here are the ways in which they parallel. The tripartite focus on birth, public life, and death. That's found in ancient biographies. That's found in the Jesus story in the Gospels. The average amount of words. Ancient biographies, on average, range in length between 10,000 and 20,000 words. Where do the Gospels fall? Matthew, 18,000 words. Mark, 11,000 words. Luke, 19,000 words. John, 15,000 words. Parallel number 3. They begin biographies with ancestry. We see this in Josephus' autobiography and Lucian's biography of Demonax. Matthew and Luke, what do they begin with? Jesus' ancestry. There's flexibility with arranging material topically or thematically rather than chronologically. The Roman biographer Suetonius writes about Caesar Augustus not in chronological order, but by categories. Well, guess what? Papias, a 2nd century bishop of Hierapolis, comments on Mark. Mark wrote down everything he remembered, though not in order, of the things either said or done by Christ. That's yet another parallel. And finally, they don't intend to tell us everything about the person. We find this in Plutarch, the Greek historian, who writes in his biography of Alexander the Great that he is not telling everything about what he did. Lucian writes in the life of Demonax that there are some things left out. What does John the Apostle say in John 21:25? There are also many other things which Jesus did, and I suppose that the world itself cannot contain the books that would be written. So notice these parallels, folks, between ancient biographies and the Gospels, which tells us that the Gospel writers intended to write reliable history. Finally, in the last few minutes I have, the Gospel writers did write reliable history. And we could spend years worth of study in going through this material, semester after semester after semester. I'm just going to share one example, Jesus' death by crucifixion. We already saw non-Christian affirmation in Flavius Josephus, Cornelius Tacitus. We also have eyewitness testimony in Luke. We have early testimony in the Creed of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 5. We have multiple attestations by Christian sources, as I said, non-Christian sources. So we have every good reason to think that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person and died by crucifixion. That's just one detail of Jesus' life that the gospel writers get right. So they did write reliable history. Archaeological evidence that confirms the gospel details. In the 19th century, the pool of Bethesda mentioned in John 5 was discovered. In 1961, there was a discovery in Caesarea of an inscription with Pontius Pilate's name. Same year, another discovery in Caesarea Maritima of the 3rd century mosaic that had the name Nazareth in it. That was the first known ancient non-biblical reference. 1968, an ossuary discovered near Jerusalem that contained the bones of a 1st century man who had been crucified. Coins of the Herodian dynasty were found. 1990 ossuary discovered that had the Aramaic words, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Folks, and that's just a sample. The archaeological evidence confirms a variety of details that these gospel writers tell us about within the 1st century. And finally, the gospel details, many of them are confirmed once again by non-Christian sources. I mentioned already to you Flavius Josephus. He writes about Caiaphas the high priest, Annas the high priest, Pontius Pilate, King Herod and his descendants, John the Baptist being killed by Herod, James, the quote-unquote brother of Jesus, and as I already mentioned, refers to Jesus as a wise man, a doer of startling deeds, put to death under Pontius Pilate. Cornelius Tacitus, we already referenced that quote. Now watch this. Suetonius, in his work, The 12 Caesars, he writes this: since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, reference to Christ, he, Claudius, expelled them from Rome. Folks, Luke's account, Luke records Claudius's actions of expelling the Christians from Rome in Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 2. So we have every good reason to conclude that these gospel writers did write reliable history. They were able, they intended, and they did. And so this mythicist objection that the Jesus story is a myth, or at least the Jesus story is a legendary development, and thus the Jesus of history is shrouded from us in the past, that is a myth. Because we have good historical grounds that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person. And in his teachings, he claimed to be God made flesh, divine. And he vindicated those claims by performing miracles, and the greatest miracle, the resurrection from the dead on the first day of the week, Sunday. And so, brothers and sisters, when you're out making disciples of all nations, persuading skeptics about the truth of Jesus Christ, now you have arrows in the quiver in order to share with them the historical knowledge of Jesus of Nazareth, and know that faith and history are not incompatible. Amen? Amen. God bless you all. Thanks for your time and attention. Thank you.